Tommy, stay with us. Help is coming.
Imagine walking outside your house and seeing 100 motorcycles lined up in your front yard, engines roaring, leather-clad bikers standing at attention. That's exactly what happened to 73-year-old Betty Thompson the morning after she made the most terrifying decision of her life. But before I tell you why those bikers showed up, I need you to hit that subscribe button because this story will change how you see strangers forever. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Now, let me take you back to that bitter February night when everything changed. The blizzard hit Cedar Falls, Iowa like a freight train. Betty was sitting in her worn velvet armchair, watching the Weather Channel through thick glasses, when the meteorologist's voice cut through her quiet evening like a knife. This is a life-threatening storm, folks. If you're on the roads right now, find shelter immediately. Betty's arthritic hands gripped her teacup tighter. She'd lived through 60 Iowa winters, but something about this one felt different. The wind wasn't just howling, it was screaming. Her small farmhouse groaned and creaked like it was fighting for its life. That's when she heard the rumble. At first, she thought it was thunder. But thunder doesn't last for 30 seconds straight. Thunder doesn't get closer, and thunder definitely doesn't come with headlights. Betty shuffled to her front window and pulled back the curtain. What she saw made her blood run cold. 15 motorcycles were pulling into her driveway, their riders hunched against the wind, snow caking their leather jackets. Even through the blizzard, she could see the patches on their backs, the skull and wings, the words that made decent people cross the street. Hell's Angels. Her first instinct was to lock the door and call the police. These weren't the kind of people who showed up at your house for cookies and conversation. These were the people her late husband Frank used to warn her about, the ones who lived by different rules. But then she saw something that stopped her cold. One of the riders had collapsed in her driveway. His bike lay on its side, steam rising from the engine. The others had gathered around him, and even through the storm, she could see they were in trouble. Real trouble. The temperature had dropped to -15. The nearest town was 12 miles away, and the Weather Service had just announced that all emergency services were suspended until the storm passed. Betty stood at that window for what felt like forever, her mind racing. She could pretend she wasn't home, turn off the lights, wait it out. But then she remembered Frank's last words to her before the cancer took him. "Betty, you've got the biggest heart in Iowa. Don't let this world make it smaller." She took a deep breath, said a prayer, and did something that would haunt her for the rest of the night. She opened the door. The wind nearly knocked her over as she stepped onto the porch. Snow whipped across her face like tiny daggers. She had to shout to be heard over the storm. "You boys need help?" 15 leather-clad faces turned toward her. In the porch light, she could see their faces, weathered, hard, covered in tattoos and scars. Some had beards down to their chests, others had shaved heads and cold eyes. The one who seemed to be their leader, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward. Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. "Ma'am, we don't want any trouble. Our buddy here is hypothermic. We just need somewhere warm until this passes." Betty looked at the fallen rider. He was young, maybe 25, and his lips were blue. His whole body was shaking. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to say no, to tell them to find somewhere else, anywhere else. Instead, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Well, don't just stand there freezing to death. Come in." If you think you know where this story is going, hit that like button because I promise you have no idea what happens next. What happened over the next 8 hours challenged everything Betty thought she knew about fear, judgment, and the human heart. The bikers filed into her small living room like lost children. They stomped snow off their boots, removed their leather jackets, and suddenly looked less like dangerous criminals and more like cold, tired men who'd made a bad decision about travel weather. Betty pointed them toward her kitchen. "There's coffee in the pot. Help yourselves." She busied herself, gathering every blanket she could find, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Not from the cold, from the reality of what she'd just done. 15 strangers in her house. And not just any strangers. The young one with the hypothermia was named Tommy. The leader, the big man with the gentle voice, was called Bear. As the night wore on, Betty learned their names, their stories, the reasons for being caught in the storm. They weren't traveling for anything sinister. They were riding to a funeral. Bear's brother had died in a car accident 3 states over. The funeral was the next morning. These men had ridden through 3 states in deteriorating weather because they'd promised to be there, because brotherhood meant something to them. "We should have stopped earlier," Bear admitted, cradling a mug of Betty's coffee. "Pride, I guess. Thought we could outrun the storm." Betty found herself doing something she never expected. She was talking to them, really talking. About Frank, about losing him, about how quiet the house had become, about how she sometimes went days without speaking to another human being. Tommy, the young one, told her about his daughter, how he was trying to get his life together for her, how the club wasn't what people thought it was. It was family for people who didn't have anywhere else to belong. As the hours passed, something extraordinary happened. The fear melted away. These dangerous-looking men helped her wash dishes. They fixed her squeaky kitchen cabinet. One of them, a quiet man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, spent 2 hours showing her pictures of his grandchildren on his phone. But around 3 in the morning, Betty discovered something that changed everything. She'd gotten up to check on Tommy, who was sleeping on her couch, when she overheard Bear talking quietly on his phone in the kitchen. "No, we can't make it. I know how important this is. I know what Danny would have wanted, but there's no way we're getting these bikes through this storm." He paused, listening. "Yeah, I know. His kids were counting on us being there. I know we promised. But what good are we to anyone if we're dead in a ditch somewhere?" Betty heard the pain in his voice, the weight of a promise he couldn't keep. That's when she realized something that made her chest tight with emotion. These men hadn't just been caught in a storm. They'd sacrificed their ability to say goodbye to their friend because they'd stopped to help Tommy. Because they wouldn't leave a brother behind. They'd chosen his life over their promise. And now they were going to miss the funeral of someone they loved because they were stranded in her living room. Betty stood in that hallway, listening to Bear's quiet conversation, and felt something she hadn't felt since Frank died. Purpose.
The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in 3 feet of snow. Betty woke up to the sound of shovels scraping against her driveway. All 15 bikers were outside, digging her out. Not just her driveway, her entire sidewalk, her path to the mailbox, even her back steps that led to her garden. Bear knocked on her door, his face red from the cold, but smiling. "Ma'am, we can't thank you enough. You saved Tommy's life last night, maybe all our lives." Betty looked at these men who'd terrified her 12 hours earlier and felt something unexpected. She was going to miss them. "You boys be careful out there," she said, handing Bear a thermos of coffee for the road. They fired up their bikes, the sound echoing off the snow-covered fields. One by one, they rode past her porch, each man nodding respectfully, some tipping imaginary hats. Betty watched until the last bike disappeared around the bend, then went back inside to her quiet house. But the quiet felt different now. Not empty, full. 3 days later, she was watering her plants when she heard it again, that rumble. But this time, it was bigger, louder, and it wasn't stopping. Betty looked out her window and nearly dropped her watering can. The road in front of her house was lined with motorcycles. Not 15 this time, more than she could count. They stretched down the entire block and around the corner. 100 bikes, maybe more. And standing in her front yard was Bear, holding something in his hands. If this story is hitting you in the feels, smash that like button, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. Betty opened her front door with trembling hands. Bear approached slowly, that same gentle smile on his face. "Ma'am, we wanted to thank you properly." He handed her a leather jacket. Not just any jacket, it was beautiful, custom-made, with intricate stitching and her name embroidered on the front, but the patch on the back that made her gasp. Honorary member, Cedar Falls chapter. You're one of us now. Family takes care of family. But that wasn't all. The bikers had pooled their money, not just the 15 who'd stayed with her, but clubs from 3 states who'd heard the story. They'd bought her groceries for a year, fixed her roof, winterized her house, set up a fund to make sure she'd never have to worry about heating bills again. And they'd done something else, something that made Betty cry for the first time since Frank's funeral. They'd adopted her. Every Sunday, a different group would stop by, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to help with yard work or repairs. Betty's quiet house filled with laughter again, with stories, with the kind of friendship she thought she'd lost forever. But the real twist, the thing that nobody saw coming, Tommy, the young biker who'd nearly died in her driveway, started bringing his daughter to visit. A sweet little girl who called Betty Grandma Betty and helped her bake cookies. 6 months later, Tommy moved into Betty's guest room, not because he needed a place to stay, because Betty needed family, and sometimes family comes in forms you never expect. The woman who'd been afraid to open her door to strangers had become the heart of an unlikely family, the grandmother to dozens of bikers, the safe harbor in a storm. And every year, on the anniversary of that blizzard, 100 motorcycles line up at Betty's house, not to thank her for one night of shelter, but to celebrate the night she taught them something they'd never forget. That courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing when you are afraid. That family isn't about blood or background or the patches you wear on your jacket. It's about showing up when someone needs you. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is judge someone by what they look like on the outside instead of who they are on the inside. Drop a comment and tell me about a time you judged someone too quickly and were completely wrong. This story shows us that our biggest blessings sometimes come disguised as our biggest fears. But here's the part that will give you chills. 2 years after that blizzard, Betty received a call that changed everything again. It was from a social worker in the next county. "Mrs. Thompson, we have an unusual situation. There's a teenage boy in foster care, and he's requested to speak with you specifically." The boy's name was Jake, 16 years old, bounced between homes for years, and about to age out of the system with nowhere to go. But Jake had heard Betty's story from Tommy, who'd been volunteering at the group home where Jake lived. When Jake showed up at Betty's door that Tuesday afternoon, she saw something familiar in his eyes. The same look Tommy had that night in the blizzard. the same look she'd had for months after Frank died. The look of someone who'd been left out in the cold. "I heard you take in strays," he said, trying to sound tough but failing to hide the hope in his voice. Betty laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in days. "Well, I suppose I do have a reputation for that now." Jake became her third unexpected family member. And through Jake came Maria, a pregnant teenager with nowhere else to go. Then came elderly Mr. Patterson from down the road, whose children never visited. Betty's small farmhouse became a different kind of clubhouse, a place where the lost found family, where the broken found healing, where the lonely found home. The bikers still came every Sunday, but now they brought their own strays. Veterans struggling with PTSD, single mothers who needed help, kids who just needed someone to believe in them. What started as one terrifying decision in a blizzard created something nobody could predicted. A community built on the radical idea that everyone deserves to belong somewhere. Betty Thompson learned that the night she opened her door to 15 strangers wasn't the night she risked her life, it was the night she got it back. And those 15 Hells Angels, they didn't just find shelter from a storm that night. They found something much more valuable. They found home. Sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones you never saw coming. Sometimes courage looks like opening your door when every instinct tells you to keep it closed. And sometimes the angels in your life come wearing leather jackets and riding Harleys. Betty's story reminds us that family isn't about who raised you. It's about who shows up when the storm hits and refuses to leave you out in the cold.